Okay, thank you so much for having me at this conference. I've always been interested in humor research, and I think this is really great. So I'm going to tell you about some of the studies that we've done over the years in my lab on irony and bilingualism and individual differences. So I don't need to tell this crowd, we can distinguish between literal statements where words communicate exactly what they mean, like this meal is delicious, versus ironic statements where it means the opposite. But I do want to distinguish between the different types of irony, which probably has been raised before. So ironic compliments, where you say, wow, what a great gourmet you are, in the context of a bad dinner, versus great job if someone performs poorly. And we all know that ironic criticisms are a little bit easier to process. They're more prevalent in language than ironic compliments. Um, it's sarcasm is a subset of irony, which is a little bit more sharper, little more sharp, pointed, where you say brilliant, just brilliant, with an exaggerated eye roll after an obvious mistake. So I just wanted to put those different definitions there because I have studies that are going to sort of hit all of them, right? So the big question that I have today is how does bilingual experience and mentalizing capacity shape irony comprehension in adults, right? So just to set the stage logically, the first thing to start with is this idea that verbal irony requires understanding that speakers often mean the opposite, a process that relies on mentalizing, executive control, and metalinguistic awareness. And Henry gave a great overview talk about this. And as I just said before, not all irony is the same. There are different kinds that are going to be more or less prevalent and easier or harder to process. And now the bilingual part comes into play, which is how does bilingual experience relate to this? I'm sorry, I can't see my slide because of the thing here. So the connection here with bilingualism is that bilingual adults routinely navigate multiple linguistic and social contexts, and that this experience may strengthen the same cognitive and social cognitive skills used for irony. So L2 versus L1 irony, in addition, could be more demanding, but the having sort of social bilingual experiences might also make people more sensitive to taking the perspective of others in a way that might make irony more prevalent, right? So this leads to our general question, right? Does bilingual experience through proficiency usage and and possibly even linguistic environments, how you are bilingual in different locations, enhance the mentalizing based processes that support irony comprehension? So I'm going to go through a series of studies that we've done that kind of suggest that this link may be there. So the very first question that we asked was, does bilingual experience impact first language L1 sarcasm use, right? So this was a study by Mergol Tiv in my lab where we had data on people on 98 English L1 participants, 88 of whom were bilingual, 10 of whom were monolingual. And as a part of this study, we had not only their language background, but also they all completed a sarcasm self-report scale that has been used in the literature by Penny and others, which rated the likelihood of using sarcasm in everyday scenarios. And they had a background questionnaire that included second language listening, pronunciation, fluency, grammar, so on and so forth, right? So this is kind of what it looks like. Please rate yourself on the following dimensions. The likelihood that you would use sarcasm with someone you just met, not at all likely, extremely likely. So, and there were a bunch of different statements like this. So we did a principle. Our first question is, to what extent does the space of sarcasm use, is it consistent with what's been reported in the literature before for presumed monolingual participants? So we did a principal component analysis on the questionnaire data, and we found three components that were similar to what had been reported before, right? The first component was a general sarcasm component. For example, how sarcastic would your friends say you are? An embarrassment diffusion component. You just got engaged over the weekend and are telling your friends about it, and frustration diffusion. So we matched what was found previously in the literature. We also did a principal component analysis on the language background measures, and we came up with two different different components, the sort of global L2 proficiency where all of the factors loaded, and then age of acquisition. But the first one took up the lion's share of the variance. So now with these two things, we could look to see to what extent is there a relationship between sarcasm use and language experience in these bilingual adults. And notably, this was for first language use. So it's not about whether people are more or less or having difficulty with sarcasm in the second language versus the first. This is how does bilingual experience impact what you do in your first language. And as you could see in this plot, we found this interesting relationship where as global L2 proficiency increased as a reflection of that first component, the self-rated general sarcasm use also increased. So global L2 proficiency, it did not predict embarrassment or frustration diffusion, but there was this relationship with the global rating, and AOA didn't modulate that either. And then we looked just to see, okay, we have this relationship, but where would the monolinguals be, just to benchmark it? And we only had 10 monolinguals here, and when we looked at the 10 monolinguals, they were benchmarked alongside like comparable to the low proficiency bilinguals, right? So there seems to be something that perhaps this was an indication, perhaps bilingual experience is making you a little bit more likely to use sarcasm in daily life. So now we ask the question, okay, so this is about self-reported language use. How might this impact the comprehension of irony? So in another paper, we looked at, does bilingual experience modulate L1 first language comprehension of irony during reading? So in this study, we had 49 bilingual adults. They did an irony comprehension task, which I'm going to tell you about in a second, where this task was presented. Here, let me just show you the task. So it was one of these standard irony setups where you have a positive scenario, such as you and your friend receive really tasty food at a supposedly 2-star restaurant. Your friend says, this food is amazing. That's a positive statement, so it matches, versus a negative statement, this food is horrendous, so it doesn't match. And then the negative scenario, you and your friend receive dry, bland food at a 4-star restaurant. The positive statement is this food is amazing. The negative statement, this food is horrendous, right? So in this case, you've got ironic criticism happening here, and you've got ironic compliment happening there. And then as a benchmark, we just had a baseline. So we get, although your new roommate claims to be a neat freak, you end up constantly tidying up after them. You tell a friend, this food is amazing, this food is horrendous. So we just wanted to have a baseline. So people saw these scenarios, and they read each scenario, and then the last sentence was presented in a standardized way. And we asked people simply to say, does that last sentence make sense? And then we recorded their reaction time, and we did LME on this. So here is what the data looked like. So this is the sensibility ratings on the top, and this is the reaction time on the bottom. So if we look at the negative scenario, which is the irony that's easy, right? This is the ironic, this is the ironic when it's a bad meal and you say what a great meal. That's the irony that we like. So you could see if it's anomalous, the sensibility ratings are super low. If it's literal, the sensibility ratings are really high, and the irony is in the middle. And what's being plotted along the x-axis here is global L2 proficiency, that component I told you about before. And there's not much of an interaction happening here with bilingual experience and the irony we like, right? But the irony that's more challenging, right, where you say something negative when somebody did something well, you could see that things are a little bit different, and they're changing as a function of bilingual experience. So again, the anomalous is on the bottom, the literal is on the top, but the irony, the sensibility ratings are low when bilingual experience is low, but they're higher when bilingual experience is high. And if we look at the reaction times, it mirrors that kind of idea, where there's very little difference for the irony that is easy to process, but for the irony that's difficult to process, the sensibility judgments are slower for low proficiency bilinguals versus high. And again, the thing to emphasize here is everybody's doing this task in their first language. Okay. All right. So now we have another question. So now we've got these two studies which suggest there might be some kind of relationship going on. So now, and presumably the link here has to do with mentalizing, right? And the idea here is that if you're engaging in bilingual communication on a daily basis, everybody mentalizes, but perhaps what's happening in bilinguals is that they're doing just a little bit extra because at least here in Montreal, you have to figure out what other languages do people know, and you have to make a lot of decisions like this, and perhaps that trains up some mentalizing capacity. So we did another experiment where now people are going to do this task in the L1 and the L2. These are different groups. So it's the same irony task as before. And now only people are reading in a self-paced fashion. And there wasn't that much on reading times. The data were noisy in the self-paced preparation. So I'm going to tell you what the outcome measures were. So these were 54 bilingual adults living in Montreal, again, English, French. And here what we did was from another task, where we studied mentalizing directly, we computed a different score for each of these people that we then used as an individual difference factor to see how do individual differences in these people in mentalizing in this other task predict something about irony processing. And then the other thing that we did, which Marigold Tiv, this was Marigold Tiv's dissertation, and she was very interested in this idea of ecological impacts on language processing. So we assessed for the bilingual kind of impact, their neighborhood language diversity, which was computed from the Statistics Canada language census data. And so we computed the bilingual diversity of the neighborhoods in which people lived based on mother tongue distribution. So now we want to see to what extent does that relate in concert with mentalizing capacity to irony processing. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what that other task was that assessed it, this was taken from another experiment where Marigold and others in the lab, they did a mentalizing task where they basically had people do inferences that depended on a logic-based inference versus a mental state inference versus an incoherent inference. So for example, Jane took out the house key, she locked the front door that day, that's very logical. Jane read about the increase in crime, she locked the front door that day. That's more mentalizing because it's the inference to make those two sentences make sense, you have to make a mentalizing inference that perhaps Jane was nervous about crime. And then we had an incoherent, Jane had a fancy pencil case, she locked the front door that day. And this is just another example. So based on these data, we could get a mentalizing rating. We did get mentalizing ratings from these people. And here we looked in this study, we looked at how individual differences in social network properties modulated this, but I'm just going to show you this quick graph to show you how there was a big difference in mentalizing across these conditions that we can then exploit to use it as an individual difference measure for irony, right? So if it was a mental state inference, everybody rated that is high in mentalizing. If it was a logical inference, they rated it as low on mentalizing. And if it was incoherent, they rated it the lowest. This study was interesting, however, because what it showed, and you could see this in the graph, is that individual differences in social networks, social network characteristics modulated this to some degree. And we could talk about that later. But suffice it to say, we have a measure that really crisply distinguishes between this mentalizing rating for logical inferences versus mental states. So that's our individual difference measure in this study. So back to irony. So we did the irony task that I told you about before. Now it's self-paced and they're making different kinds of ratings. They're making an appropriateness rating and they're making an appropriateness rating, which is kind of like a sensibility rating, but it could be a little different. We could talk about that later. And then they're making an irony rating. So you could see for the irony ratings, the ironic instances are rated much higher than the literal instances. So that's good. But for appropriateness, they're their ironic ratings are lower than the literal, but now we're showing a difference between ironic compliments and criticisms, right? So the ironic criticisms, which is the irony we tend to like, are rated as a little bit more appropriate than the ironic compliments. And also for the literal compliments versus literal criticisms, if a statement is positive, that's rated as more appropriate than if a statement is negative, right? So there's some affecting that's going on in here as well with these data, okay? And this is collapsed across L1 and L2, and in this study, we found no L1, L2 differences. So I'm just gonna present all the data fused together. And then this is just reaction time showing that the literal complements, so the positive literal statements are the fastest compared to the others, which is interesting because it shows that affect has some role independent of irony. Okay, so this is the really complicated plot. So here now what I'm doing is I'm breaking out the data in terms of language, in terms of mentalizing is along the bottom. We have the appropriateness ratings on the top, the irony ratings on the bottom. So, and then we have people who come from a low neighborhood language diversity environment versus a high, right? So let's look at these data first. So what do we see here? Well, we see that the perceived irony rating is much higher for the ironic statements than the literal, so that's good. But that difference increases, the crispness of distinguishing those two gets bigger as mentalizing increases. And that's true for people who live in the low neighborhood language diversity area and the high. But on top of that, there was an interaction between neighborhood language diversity in that this increase is more crisp in the high diverse neighborhood. So there's something that suggests here that both mentalizing ability plus the environment, the linguistic diversity of the environment in which you live is modulating how well people are distinguishing between irony versus not irony. Now, the appropriateness rating I find to be very interesting, given that these people are all responding in the same, like roughly the same way, a little bit more intense here, but the appropriateness ratings are really changing. So if we look at the people in the high neighborhood density neighborhoods, we could see that these people are rating irony as way less appropriate across the board, and they're not really distinguishing between the irony that's hard versus the irony that's easy. So these people don't like irony very much, right? They're not seeing it as very appropriate, okay? Whereas, and this, however, as mentalizing goes up, perhaps there's a little bit of a change, like it's getting a little bit higher. But if you look at the people who come from the low neighborhood diversity, here they have less of an issue with irony unless their mentalizing skills are high. Okay, so this sort of interaction is interesting to me because it suggests that people who are distinguishing between irony and not irony are differentially saying that it's appropriate or not, right? So this might have something to do with the social aspects of irony and and how people maybe empathy, so on and so forth. So this is potentially interesting. So this just gives you the lowdown of everything that I just tried to tell you. And then one last study is all of the studies I just told you about before were either questionnaire based, and some were speeded decisions, but we wanted to see if we had people read in an eye tracking situation these same kinds of ironic statements that I told you about, and if we did it in a within subjects manner, would we find differences in L1, L2, or how bilingual experience pushes it around? And this was important, I thought, because most of the literature on irony in bilinguals look at it between subjects, right? So if there happen to be differences between your L1 subjects and your L2 subjects in anything relating to irony, that could potentially cloud interpretation of what you're looking at. So we wanted to try to do it in a within subjects manner where we created the irony materials in English and in French, and then we had the same bilinguals go through it, and we sorted the data into relative to their own L1 or their own L2. Okay, so what did we find when we did this? Well, here we're looking at two different kinds of eye tracking measures. This is first pass gaze duration for the irony region. And then this is total reading time for the irony region. This is the same kinds of materials that I told you about before. So this is getting at time course a little bit. So someone before asked about fast versus slow processing. And my sense is that that kind of Kahneman idea has a lot to do with language processing. Only in the language processing literature, we call it early measures, first pass, automatic activation versus controlled, right? So this hopefully gets at that a little bit. So what we could see in the first pass gaze duration measures of the irony region is that the ironic complements are much or slower than the others, and that's similar to the literal criticism. So basically what seems to be happening is that the statements that are negative are a little bit slower than both statements that are positive, right? So that's sort of interesting. But then as it's because it's suggesting that if you've got irony that is the irony you're used to, you're reading that fine on the first pass. It's just the irony that's more difficult to understand that you're slower with, right? And then that persists to total reading time, in that the one thing that's different from the others is this ironic complement condition, which is the irony that's hard to understand compared to the other conditions. Okay, so in terms of bilingual language experience, we found no difference in these data between L1 and L2 within subjects. Um, and the only effect of bilingual experience that we found was on go past times, right? So go past time is an interesting eye tracking measure, and Henry's video before showed it. Like, that was beautiful, Henry's video before. So go past time is if you have the eye moving along text and it lands in a region, and let's say it's the irony region, it counts up the fixations, and let's say the eye and the brain gets confused, so the eye goes back, and then it goes back to that region. So all of those fixations I just described on the region are included in go past time. It's basically all the sum of the fixations necessary to go past the critical region. Okay, so some people, is that an early measure, a late measure? I'm not sure. It's one of these in between measures. But this measure really showed that if you have ironic criticism, people have very little difficulty with this, whether they're reading in their L1 or their L2. But if it's an ironic complement, they're slower. But the thing that is probably a little different than what's in the literature is we looked at how bilingual experience manipulated this. So for that, we used an individual difference measure called language entropy. And the idea of language entropy is it's sort of tracking to what extent as a bilingual are you predictably using your languages in one context or another. So if you are a bilingual who always compartmentalizes your L1 in one kind of social context versus your L2 in another, you would be low entropy, right? Because you could be highly predictable. But if you're someone who's very integrated, then you're going to be high entropy. So the bottom line here is that as entropy increases, if we look at the difference between the black bars, which is the L1, you could see as entropy increases, the reading time, the go past time goes down for the ironic condition, but it's going up a little bit for the literal. So that difference means that irony is getting a little bit easier relatively to the literal. And for the L2, it doesn't show that, right? So for the L2, as entropy goes up, reading time gets faster, but the ironic is still, the ironic is still slower than the literal. So there seems to be something going on here of how people use their languages in day-to-day life, and how this may impact the degree to which irony is a little bit more challenging than the literal. So this is what I have to say to you. I don't know if I have how much time I have left, but the conclusions are, for me, what's important here is that when L1 and L2 is examined between or within subjects, there's very little impact on processing for this categorical difference, but the effects that we tend to see seem to vary with continuous measures of bilingual experience. And this is important to me because, as some of you know, in the bilingualism literature, there's all this stuff about bilingual advantages and so on and so forth, right? And I don't want to sort of go down that road with this question. Rather, it's more interesting to say that there are certain kinds of experiences that if you load up on those experiences, and perhaps certain kinds of bilingualism is one of those experiences, that there's something that co-varies with abilities that go beyond just the basics of language processing. So I don't want this to be a bilingual advantages story. I want this to be more a story about how experience tunes broader abilities, and it could be bidirectional. Obviously, there's a lot more work that needs to be done here. So taken together, this shows that how one uses multiple languages, not simply being bilingual, might shape pragmatic comprehension. And perhaps this is reminiscent of the literature on children, some of which we heard today, talking about empathy. Like, there are all these skills that are riding under the surface of our ability to use language, and to use language in this kind of way, in this ironic way, in a humorous way, that there's so many moving parts that trying to get a handle on how all they vary together is really important. So I have lots of open questions. How does language use across social networks impact irony? How do people's reading goals and the social context modulate bilingual irony processing, right? A lot of times in psycholinguistics, we assume that when we do a comprehension task, that everybody's goals are equivalent, right? And that they're like what our goals are when we're engaging in communication in the real world, but they may not be, right? So I think we need to move in the direction of manipulating goals and figuring out, when we find differences, are the goals the same or are the goals different? Of course, how did we bring in executive control? How does irony processing relate to other forms of mentalizing? And one thing we've been looking at lately is, how do these things manifest in spontaneous speech and or digital communication? And we're doing this because we're engaged in a study looking at schizophrenia and spontaneous discourse. So one question that I have is, irony a kind of sociolinguistic, cognitive, or mentalizing indicator species that can help us track other things, right? So we have, this is one of my students, Shaima, and I'm working with Lena Kalanipan at the Douglas Hospital, where we're trying to extract markers, linguistic markers of theory of mind, and other kinds of features, not only because it's interesting on its own, but also to track language behavior in people who have psychopathology. And that's been raised previously in other talks here, right? That irony really brings it all together, right? Irony and elements of language like irony, it's bringing together social capacities, cognitive capacities, linguistic capacities, and together, and lots of populations have issues with irony, and that could be for different reasons, right? So in some ways, it's a very convenient tool to try to track pathology in other ways. And there could be links to humor processing, of course, or certain kinds of jokes that rely on a sort of mentalizing stance versus something else. Are they going to be more preferred by people who have bilingual experience or not? So there's lots of open questions. Thank you so much.